Hello, and welcome back to Behind the Walls of the World's Psychiatric Hospitals. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Gallup. I'm back after a week away from spending time with friends and family, and I hope wherever you are that you are doing something to renew and refresh yourself. There's a lot going on in the world right now, so I hope you're doing what you need to do to take care of yourself. Now, let's jump back into the history of Willard State Hospital in the Finger Lakes region of New York. We left off last week around 1904, when changes started to happen at Willard, particularly regarding the names of different buildings and the hospital name itself. That's when it changed from Willard Asylum for the Chronically Insane to Willard State Hospital. You might also remember that this was after the 1890 State Care Act, which divided New York State into different hospital districts. After this passed, Willard only accepted patients from certain hospital districts and started taking acute cases, which it had not done before. And just an aside, because I don't think I mentioned it last time, when we're talking about acute cases, those are basically emergency admissions from the community. We still refer to them as acute cases today. If someone is in psychiatric distress, whether they're thinking of suicide or having severe symptoms of psychosis or threatening others, they can be taken to the emergency department of a local hospital. If that person is deemed to need more care than the emergency department can offer, they can be placed on a 48 to 72-hour hold, depending on the state, and then transferred to an acute psychiatric hospital. In the late 19th century, these folks were taken to poorhouses. After the 1890 Act was passed, these folks could be directly admitted to Willard or to another state hospital for temporary treatment unless or until they were later committed. Now, as I mentioned in the last episode, I'm going to be drawing most of my information about the history of Willard State Hospital from a really great online source by Seneca County historian Walter Gable. He published this in 2018, so it's up to date and very thorough, and I encourage you to check it out. He's included a lot of pictures that I think are helpful to get a good sense of where this is happening and who the people are, and I'll include the link to that source in the transcript for this episode. Now, even though we ended in 1904 during the last episode, I'm going to go back in time for just a moment to set the stage for what conditions were like for employees at the asylum. Gable notes that for the first century of the hospital's operation, attendants slept on wards with the patients, although they had their own rooms. And this reminded me of how Dr. Greenacre slept in a room on a violent patient ward in Trenton Psychiatric Hospital while she was conducting her investigation on Dr. Cotton. And if you haven't listened to her episode in the New Jersey State Lunatic Asylum series, I encourage you to do so. I said then, and I'll say again now, I don't think I could reside on a unit with patients, even if I had my own room. But that's what attendants did for a long time. There wasn't even a night attendant at Willard until 1884. There was only a night watchman who conducted rounds every once in a while. Even today, night shifts are generally the least eventful, but when incidents do happen, there are fewer staff to respond to them. So to think that there were no regular staff on the wards at night is really scary. It leaves patients vulnerable to abuse by other patients or staff, increases the risk of medical emergencies not being responded to in time, and increases the risk of death by suicide. Hospitals today make regular rounds even at night just to make sure the patients are not experiencing distress. And later, Willard became a training facility for psychiatric employees. In 1886, it became a training school for attendants, and by 1890, it added a training program for nurses. The nursing program was 2 years long and included almost every training aspect of any other hospital except for obstetrics and pediatrics, since these were apparently not needed at Willard. I think these probably should have been included. If there are men and women housed at the same facility, there's always a risk of pregnancy, no matter how closely staff watch them. And now we know they weren't being watched at night. It's just my 2 cents. By 1909, the population at Willard was growing. There were 2,345 patients on the grounds and 500 employees, about 272 who specifically worked on the wards. In the state hospitals where I've worked, there have typically been twice as many total employees as patients, so the staffing numbers at Willard weren't ideal. All staff received board, lodging, and laundry services, so I guess that's sort of a bonus. The staffing shortages became even more of a problem after the US entered World War I and in the years following the war. From the Willard staff, almost 30 men joined the Army, and 7 nurses went to assist in the war effort. Others left the hospital to work in munitions factories. There were 58 staff vacancies in 1919, and no one applying for the work. Even worse, the hospital was overcrowded by 15%, and another hospital district was added to Willard's roster, adding even more patients. Staff morale was low, and as we've seen with other hospitals, in an attempt to work around the low staff numbers, higher functioning patients served in the role of attendants. Gable doesn't explicitly state this, but I think it's a fair assumption that accidents or outright abuse occurred as a result of this. Patients aren't trained for their role of attendants, so it'd be easy to make an unintentional mistake. Around the same time, Willard was hit by the influenza epidemic of 1918 and 1919. Almost 500 patients got sick and 90 died from the illness. Almost 200 employees fell ill and 2 died. Now, remember that there were 500 total employees and only 272 working on the wards at this time. So 200 sick employees would severely affect the hospital's ability to function normally. But the influenza epidemic of 1918 and 1919 weren't the only illnesses that plagued patients at Willard. The primary cause of death at the hospital was pulmonary tuberculosis, which led to the construction of tuberculosis pavilions, one for women and later one specifically for men. Other causes of death at the asylum were apoplexy, or what we call today strokes, pneumonia, general debility, and syphilis of the nervous system. Gable notes that for many years, the annual mortality rate of patients was 5 to 7%, meaning that if the hospital averaged about 2,000 patients, about 100 to 150 would die each year. The patients who died at Willard were first sent to the morgue, of course, which had been built in 1870. Now, the cemeteries at Willard hold many, many stories. The original cemetery was located near the first building, which was initially called the Agricultural College, later called the Branch Building, and finally named Grandview. Patients who died at Willard when the hospital first opened were sent there, but they quickly outgrew the original cemetery and needed additional space. The hospital acquired a large section of land nearby for a new cemetery. And in the northwest corner, there's a section for at least 38 Willard patients who had served in the American Civil War. In that section, each grave has a marker. Most are made of stone and identify basic information about the person's service in the Civil War. A handful of markers are wooden. Gable points out that some of the Civil War veterans buried in the cemetery came from nearby Seneca County, but most came from other parts of New York State. They served in the Army and Navy for the Union. Some, Gable says, were deserters. Some were held as prisoners of war. Some received pensions for their service. But strangely and sadly, this is pretty much the only section of the cemetery that has gravestones. On the south side of the cemetery is a Jewish section that is marked with an arch. A memorial stone dedicated in spring 1995 reads, quote, "In remembrance of the Jewish residents buried at Willard Psychiatric Center, 1870 to 1992, end quote. Throughout the history of the hospital, a total of 5,776 patients will be buried in this cemetery. Now, remember that it's still considered taboo at this time to have family members with severe mental illness. So most of these remains went unclaimed. They were buried and given a marker on their grave with only a number to identify them. No names, no dates, just forgotten. And we'll come back to the story of the Willard Cemetery in an upcoming episode. An incident occurred in 1921 that would bring additional focus and scrutiny on Willard. On May 19th, 1921, a 21-year-old veteran named William O'Brien, who had been labeled a difficult patient at Willard, assaulted several patients and nurses and destroyed hospital property. He was subdued after a struggle with attendants, but died shortly after. Now, I was intrigued by this story, so I looked it up on newspapers.com, my new favorite website, and I was only able to find one article on this incident, but it didn't say anything about O'Brien's alleged assaults on staff and peers. But both Gable's record and the newspaper article mentioned O'Brien's sudden and mysterious death. They both agree that O'Brien's body was found on his ward hours after he died. The article from the May 26, 1921 edition of the Buffalo Inquirer stated that several of O'Brien's ribs were broken, one of which had punctured his lung. His body was badly bruised, and his chest had been crushed. Now, let me just say that when a patient becomes dangerously aggressive like this today, they do not, or should not, end up in a condition like this. Today, we use stabilization techniques that are designed to keep both staff and patients as safe as possible. In this case at Willard, though, O'Brien appears to have been beaten to death by staff. And so an investigation was launched, initiated by the American Legion. The hospital's board of managers and the U.S. Veterans Bureau agreed, along with the district grand jury. Even the New York governor visited the hospital after this incident. In the end, the attendants were exonerated. And I'd really like to know how they arrived at that conclusion. Instead, they seemed to blame O'Brien, noting that he had been discharged from the service on a disability and had been committed to Willard afterward. Without knowing too much else about O'Brien, I wonder if he was experiencing what we now know as PTSD, which can sometimes leak out as aggression. It's impossible to know now, but it sounds like it could have been such a preventable tragedy. As the 20th century moved on and the number of patients increased, Willard, along with asylums around the country, were looking for new ways to treat mental illness. You may remember from episode 12 that Dr. John Harvey Kellogg, the inventor of cornflakes, was a proponent of proper nutrition. He also believed in the power of hydrotherapy in the form of Turkish baths. So this was tried at Willard. And like many other hospitals around the US, by 1937, insulin shock treatment and metrazole shock treatment were used. Fortunately, these inhumane treatments didn't last, and by 1942, electroshock was substituted in its place. And yes, I realize how odd it sounds that electroshock therapy is the better alternative to these other forms of shock treatment. At the very least, electroshock therapy didn't induce grand mal seizures and break bones like the other two procedures sometimes did. Also, like hospitals of the time, Willard offered a number of recreational opportunities in which patients could participate. At Willard, Hadley Hall was the place where most of these activities took place. Gable explains that there were, quote, drills, marching, calisthenics, games, including bowling, and classes in embroidery and basket making, end quote. Among the pictures in Gable's article is a picture of a 4-lane bowling alley and images of the auditorium from the 1990s. He adds that, quote, there were team sports such as basketball, baseball, softball, and quoits, end quote. I had to look up what quoits were, and I found out it's a game that's sort of similar to horseshoe, where the goal is to throw a circle around a small metal pole. So if you didn't know like I didn't, now you know. Quote, bus trips were organized to take patients to Roseland Amusement Park, Finger Lakes Racetrack, local football games and state parks, and Corning Glassworks. What became known as the Bona Vista Golf Course provided opportunities for patients to play golf, swim, and go fishing, end quote. And I love this idea. Recreation, having fun, getting outside, these are all therapeutic activities. One of the reasons why patients psychiatrically decompensate is because of boredom. When there are few choices of things to do, patients' moods go down, and they're more likely to get themselves into trouble. That's why this aspect of the early hospitals is so appealing to me. When people are treated like people, they tend to recover quickly. And what they did at Willard was use various forms of treatment, those recreational activities, vocational work, musical treatment, physiotherapy, hydrotherapy, even electroshock therapy as a precursor to individual psychotherapy. The rationale was that the ancillary treatments would restore neglected or rejected patients to a frame of mind where they could participate more meaningfully in psychotherapy. I have mixed feelings about this. On the one hand, I can see how it could be effective for some patients who are struggling with depression or anxiety to socialize and participate in activities before starting therapy, but I don't think it's critical. And some patients, particularly those who are highly delusional, don't respond well to individual therapy. They could play all the golf in the world, for instance, and their delusions would remain intact. Even antipsychotic medications aren't really effective in treating most delusions, especially if they're deeply entrenched. And for that person, the delusion has become their reality. Now, I briefly mentioned in the last episode that many patients worked at the hospital as part of their treatment program. While it likely had therapeutic benefits, the hospital was exploiting patient labor for their gain. Using unpaid patient labor saved them from having to hire someone to do those jobs, and they often profited from the patient's work. Gable noted that, quote, in 1955, it was reported that the value of articles made by the patients was $50,427.28, and the value of farm and garden produce used for food was $173,303.70, end quote. That's quite a profit at the hands of unpaid patient labor. I'm going to rewind just a little bit. By the start of World War II, understaffing was again a serious problem. Gable points out that a total of 114 employees were away in military service. In 1943, there were 95 male ward employees trying to perform the duties of 217. There was a temptation among employees who were left to leave for better paying work, and some did. Fortunately, the new New York State legislature agreed to offer salary increases and overtime pay, which helped retain some workers. Those who were left behind still had to worry about gas and tire rations, causing additional problems for travel to and from the hospital. And yet, after the war in 1946, after all those wartime rations, someone had to suggest that Willard be completely made over. The plan was that all the existing buildings should be demolished and new ones built in their place. A total of $5.6 million was set aside for this project. But then with inflation, someone realized that this plan would probably be unrealistic, and the plan was abandoned. That's probably a good thing. Remember that the 1940s and 1950s were the start of major patient overpopulation at state hospitals across the US. At Willard, they would need that money for patient treatment and building additional buildings, not replacing existing ones. During World War II, the Sampson Naval Training Station was built near Willard on the east side of Seneca Lake. The station also included a 1,500-bed hospital. After the war ended, the training station was turned over to the VA, and 900 tuberculosis patients were sent there. By 1948, the state took over the complex with the plan to use the hospital for 1,000 elderly patients. But by the following year, only 400 elderly patients were there. 10 years later, in September 1958, the state formally leased the site for $1 a year, and it became known as the Sampson Division of Willard State Hospital. It was used to house, quote, mildly psychotic elderly patients, end quote. So I'm thinking like maybe dementia cases or something like that, and folks with intellectual disabilities. That's what we used to call mental retardation. Now, even though the Sampson Division was technically part of Willard State Hospital, the population numbers of both facilities were kept separate. For instance, Gable points out that by May 1962, there were 2,582 patients at Willard proper and an additional 853 patients at Sampson. Starting in 1955, psychotropic medications were introduced at Willard. These were primarily antipsychotics, tranquilizers, antidepressants. Like the other hospitals we mentioned, the rise of psychiatric medications led to a corresponding decrease of patient workers. The focus of treatment essentially shifted. It made patients easier to treat, which was probably an advantage since this was during the height of institutionalization, but they became more sedated. And as I mentioned earlier, between the Willard campus and the Sampson complex, the hospital had a grand total of 3,435 patients in 1962, the most it ever housed. It was also in 1962 that rumors floated around that Willard would be closing. Fortunately, this was quickly debunked, but it started a concern that would last for decades. Now, this next part should sound familiar. Then came the Community Mental Health Act of 1963. It feels like a refrain we could say at this point. The intent of the act, as we've discussed in previous episodes, was to reduce the number of patients housed in various institutions in half in approximately 20 years. Willard was somewhat slow at transitioning patients into the community. By 1965, Willard still had a little over 3,000 patients between the main campus and Sampson. Just 4 years later, the Sampson complex was no longer a division of Willard State Hospital, and Willard's population dwindled to 1,700 patients. The Sampson division became known as, and this is the original name, the Sampson State School for the Adult Mentally Retarded. We definitely would not use that name today. The Sampson School remained open only 2 more years before being closed due to budget cuts in December 1971. After the Community Mental Health Act of 1963, treatment at Willard started to focus more on preparing patients for discharge to the community. They added multidisciplinary teams that would plan and deliver the treatment for approximately 100 to 200 patients. And we still have these today. Each unit at the state hospital has a psychiatrist, psychologist, social worker, and recreation therapist that are responsible for determining what treatment each patient needs according to their specific discipline. So my role as a psychologist, for instance, means that I'm in charge of evaluating each patient's risk of suicide, self-harm, and violence while they're at the hospital. If any of those is elevated, then I create interventions that will lessen or eliminate the risk. What feels so second nature to me now was a fairly new concept in the 1960s. Willard was also the first hospital in New York to have a full-time rehabilitation service. Gable points out that, quote, the center was a complex designed to provide the services and activities which cannot be provided in the individual home county units, end quote. So what they tried to do during this period was group patients together based on their home county. All patients from Seneca or Ontario counties, for instance, would live together, even if their treatment groups were in other buildings. I don't necessarily understand the rationale for grouping patients together based on home location, but that's what they did. And Gable outlined many of the highlights that the rehabilitation program at Willard offered. One, there was a little house, which was developed to simulate as much as possible a home environment. Now, one of the hospitals where I used to work had something similar on discharge units. They had a mock apartment with a kitchenette where patients could learn to cook simple meals and see what might be essential items that they would need. And this is really important because some patients have been institutionalized for so long with their basic needs mostly done for them that they may not know what they'll need once they're on their own in the community. They may also not know how to use basic appliances that most of us take for granted. I'm glad that Willard offered this to their patients too, because it's really an essential component to preparing for discharge. 2, they had a store called the Circle Shop, which was managed by patients. Customers would come in and purchase donated articles using chips. And I love this idea. Another hospital where I did training had something similar that was based on the psychological concept of a token economy. Patients would earn a token of some kind by attending groups, participating in activities, and so on. And they could purchase items like clothing, art supplies, stamps, envelopes, candy, et cetera, with those tokens. And I found that that was motivating for patients to participate in their treatment because they had those incentives that they could work toward. I'm definitely a behaviorist in my approach to psychology. So working toward incentives is a main focus for me in my work. Number 3, there was a halfway house that provided transitional, semi-independent living off the county units for patients who'd be returning to the community and hopefully back to work. I think this is one of the most helpful ways to prepare patients for their return to the community. It gives them structure and stability, but also offers some freedom. Oregon State Hospital used to have a program like this, although it was discontinued a few years back. There are cottages on the Salem campus where psychiatrists or psychiatrist residents used to live that were later used for patients at the discharge level. It gave patients a chance to use the kitchen, live semi-independently with roommates, and practice doing daily chores while also attending their groups and other treatment. Unfortunately, again, due to budget cuts, the cottage program at Oregon State Hospital ended, and discharge level patients were moved back into the secure area of the hospital. And it really was a loss for the hospital and for those patients. 4, rehabilitation recreation offered different individual or group activities that patients could join in. And we talked about this earlier. It's really important for patients to engage in activities they enjoy in order to socialize and even serve as a distraction for their symptoms. 5, the sheltered workshop offered a realistic work situation for patients. Gable doesn't provide much other information about what this means, but I would hope that it included preparing patients for, what paperwork they might need to get a job, showing up on time, clocking in and out, those sorts of things. I should also add that by 1973, the mental hygiene law passed in New York and declared that patients should earn at least federal minimum wage for their work. It's about time. So just for reference, that means that patients at Willard were working for free for about 100 years before they saw a paycheck. The disadvantage to this, of course, was that it meant fewer patients could actually work due to, and say it with me, to budget cuts. Number 6, finally, patients who were still high school age were offered educational programs. There are still quite a few hospitals, state hospitals around the US that offer a sort of hybrid program for juveniles who are undergoing psychiatric treatment but also need to finish school. Most state hospitals also offer GED or an equivalent courses for adults who weren't able to complete school. And I love it when my patients are finally able to get their high school certificate and then discharged to the community, knowing that they have a leg up from when they got arrested. And I love seeing how proud of themselves they are too. The rumors of closing Willard came back again in the early 1970s. By 1974, the hospital had again rebranded. This time it was renamed Willard Psychiatric Center. But a new name couldn't change the fact that the old buildings were showing definite signs of wear. The main building, which was later renamed Chapin House in 1904, was slated for demolition in 1974. Since it was listed on the National Register of Historical Places, quote, Destruction was stayed after a technical assistant grant from the New York State Council for the Arts sponsored a survey of the building complex, end quote. But the stay wouldn't last long. Chapin House was later demolished in 1986. Throughout the 70s, the patient population continued to decline as patients were transitioned back to the community. By 1977, there were 890 patients left at Willard, meaning that about 1,000 patients had discharged or transferred to other institutions over the past decade. By 1981, only 709 patients remained. I'm going to step back for just a second and just notice how I conveyed that information, because I hadn't quite realized my bias until just now. So, excuse me for a moment. This is the former English instructor in me coming out. So bear with me if this sounds picky. But I like to be as transparent as I can with you. So I had originally written that last sentence as, by 1981, there were 709 patients. But I changed it almost without thinking about it to, by 1981, only 709 patients remained. And as soon as I wrote that, I recognized my bias. And whether I realized it or not, part of me is sad or disappointed that there were fewer and fewer patients in these hospitals as time moved on. And part of that, I think, is because I know the end of the story. The hospital is moving toward an inevitable decline and closure. And just to be clear, I do not want to go back to the height of institutionalization, where hospitals were crammed with patients whose presence was questionable at best. You know, they shouldn't have been at the hospital at all, some of them at least. So I'm glad that part is over. But I also feel this dread, knowing that many of the patients who were discharged around that time were probably not ready to leave. They may have ended up unhoused or in jail or in prison. And we have the same problem today in the US. There are many patients who no longer meet criteria to stay in the hospital, but they aren't quite ready to go yet either. They need a structured housing environment in the community. And although these facilities do exist, there just aren't enough of them. And the bar is usually set really high for people to get in. Anyway, I digress. I just caught that bias of mine and wanted to share what my thinking was. So back to Willard. In the 1980s, the patient population continued to decline. This was also the time of a recession, and budget cuts were impacting many areas of society, including Willard. And by the end of the decade, the rumors about closure had returned, this time a bit more seriously. The New York governor was looking at the mounting state deficit and making plans for what could go. In February 1991, with the state budget deficits at $6 billion, over 100 employees from Willard were laid off. An article from the Democrat and Chronicle mentions that, quote, legislation approved in 1993 called for the closing of several mental health facilities across the state. But the bill said that Willard would not be closed until a significant alternative use for the site could be found, end quote. So for the time remaining, at least, Willard was safe. It certainly would have an impact on the community. Closing the center would remove 450 jobs and $20 million payroll from the community. In 1994, though, plans were being made to close Willard indefinitely the following year. But the hope was to essentially repurpose the facility as another type of treatment program. And so it was decided that Willard would close the following year, and in its place, the old hospital would house a residential drug treatment program for nonviolent prisoners. The remaining patients were discharged to the community or transferred to other hospitals. Willard employees were offered the chance to transfer to the state hospital in Elmira. When Willard Psychiatric Center officially closed on Wednesday, June 21st, 1995, there were 135 patients residing there. And so, in 1995, Willard State Hospital became the Willard Drug Treatment Campus, which was part of the New York State Department of Corrections. It operated as a parole program for low-level drug offenders and could house up to 856 men and women, Treatment included a 3-month stay using a highly structured and regimented boot camp that Walter Gable called a, quote, shock incarceration style program, end quote. I don't know what that means, but it sounds scary. Quote, a mile of security fencing was erected around 110 acres containing the old state hospital buildings, Hatch, Birches, and Sunnycroft. Buildings such as Grandview, Hadley Hall, and Edgemere were renovated to become training facilities for the staff. Other former Willard Hospital buildings were left largely neglected, end quote. So essentially, this treatment center offered an alternative to jail or prison for their drug offenses or parole violations. People at Rikers Island, for instance, were told they could plead and go to the 90-day treatment at Willard or stand in front of a judge and risk going back to prison. The timing of all this was unfortunate because employees who had hoped to transfer to the new drug treatment facility wouldn't be able to start for several months after Willard closed. The Department of Corrections would have to set up their new operation in the existing buildings and renovate as needed. That left prospective employees from the area searching for temporary work or relocating for other work. To further complicate the issue, New York had a statewide hiring freeze at the time, so some former Willard employees simply weren't able to get work. The Willard Drug Treatment Center stayed open until March 2022, when budget cuts closed 6 prisons around New York, including Willard, for good. Now, I'm not sad about prisons closing due to fewer numbers of inmates. That is a good thing. And so now, 154 years after it opened, the old Willard buildings were boarded up, largely abandoned. So that's the story of Willard State Hospital. But the story doesn't exactly end there. Next week, we're going to rewind to 1995, when the state hospital closed, but before the Department of Corrections took over. A Willard employee was going through the hospital buildings looking for anything that could be salvaged when she stumbled upon treasure. But I'll talk about that in next week's episode. So thank you again for listening. I know I say it in every episode, but I appreciate you for listening and sharing. If you haven't done so already, please feel free to join the Facebook group and get pictures from the episode, learn some behind the scenes information, and connect with other listeners. Also, if you haven't done so already, please rate and review the show wherever you listen, but especially if you're listening on Apple Podcasts. That helps other people find the show, and I love reading your reviews. So, see you next week. Can I say see you next week on a podcast? Does that make sense? Anyway, come back next week for more about Willard State Hospital, and remember, do the best you can until you know better, and then when you know better, do better. Until next time. Thank you so much for listening to Behind the Walls of the World's Psychiatric Hospitals. Once again, I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Gallup. Cover image is by Christopher Payne. Check out my website at behindthewallspodcast.buzzsprout.com. Follow the podcast and learn more on Facebook at Behind the Walls Podcast and Instagram at Behind the Walls Pod. For questions or recommendations, email me at behindthewallspodcast@gmail.com. You can find new episodes every Monday on Amazon Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you're listening right now. If you like the show, please rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts. It helps other people find and listen to the show, and I would be so grateful. Please stay tuned for more episodes of Behind the Walls of the World's Psychiatric Hospitals. Until next time.